Are you kidding me? That's probably the most correct thing the man has ever said.
Well, I would say that Dan Mays has said a lot crazier things than saying that the Denver Post might be out to get him. I don't think they're out to get him. And I think I give Tim a lot of credit. He wrote that story about, started the ball rolling with the liberal Kansas story, and clearly Dan Mays has a lot of questions to answer on that and many other things.
Even today's story, which was, how was he fired, or what was the deal on that? I mean, it just keeps coming out.
But I think, there are questions, not so much in the newsroom, because I know a lot of the people that cover these races, and I think they do a great job. But I think the editorial page, especially in putting out an editorial immediately after the Karen Crummy story about Scott McInnes, McInnes must exit this race, and then following up Tim's story a couple weeks ago, right up on the eve of that deadline for the ballot certification, and saying Dan Mays must get out. I mean, this is the only newspaper of record we have in the state, and I think that, there's rumblings about the publisher, Dean Singleton, getting involved in some of these races, making phone calls, trying to get Republicans to pull their support back from Dan Mays.
When you say Dean Singleton getting involved, it's his paper. He can write whatever he wants on the editorial pages. Are you talking that
I'm not saying that he's influencing the editorial page, or certainly not the news page, but I'm saying that it's a one newspaper town, and I think Dan Mays has said a lot crazier things than something might be lost in, well, the UN bike thing. I mean, we can go on down the list. But to say that there's one newspaper in this town and it has maybe undue influence on this election and may be targeting him, I mean, he's made himself a target, let's be honest. But let's also be honest, if Republicans needed a newspaper story to say that, to have an epiphany, a collective epiphany that here's a candidate who's got some warts, I mean, where have they been all year? So I think that Dan Mays, I don't think any of Tim's, or most of the Post's coverage has been unfair, but I think there are some headlines in different races also that have been head scratchers. And I think when the Rocky Mountain News went away, I think the community definitely lost something.
Right. I don't want to hurt your feelings, but newspapers are just not as important as they used to be. Although what you guys
are you talking about?
What you're talking about? Although what you guys are doing online with the blog is really great stuff. I mean, it's up to date and fast because we get our stuff through internet now, and you guys are certainly adding to that. But the editorial page weighing down, the Denver Post editorial page says this. It's not as powerful as I think it used to be. Maybe I'm wrong.
It still shows up in these TV ads, though. Michael Bennett, they condemn an Andrew Romoff ad, and then Bennett runs.
But the thing is, what ads? What ads will Mays have? He has no money.
But I'm not just talking about the coverage of the Mays race. I'm talking overall. Right. And, I think that's tough when you have one big voice in a state.
I wonder about whether this isn't in some ways fortuitous for Republicans. There are some issues with them possibly becoming a minor party, and I don't think that the ACP is going to become a huge deal in the state. Technically, I think it qualifies them to get on a whole lot more ballots in the future, but I think, if anything, they'll just be a spoiler going forward. But to me, when you look at this election cycle, you're looking at a guy who's the Denver mayor. He's the mayor of a city. This is not a crisis city. Okay, we're not talking about Detroit, Baltimore, Cleveland, somewhere like that. This is a relatively wealthy city, a city with relatively fewer social problems, well-off populace. He's an ambassador for the city. The residents of the city tend to give him what he wants. More taxes? Okay, sure.
A lot more taxes, a lot more debt. No Denver mayor, in fact, I would say no Denver or Colorado Democrat has ever been as successful as selling tax and debt as Hickenlooper. And he does so brilliantly.
And try to imagine how that translates on a statewide scale. Is that going to be the case when he goes to, and when you are in you're governing a state that University of Denver now says will be in a perpetual budget crisis because of the needs of the budget and the anticipated revenue. Even if revenues come back significantly, we will be in a perpetual budget crisis. Whoever becomes governor is going to be in a world of poo, okay? And so, in a way, you wonder whether it's actually somewhat fortuitous for Republicans this side, because you're looking at potentially $1 billion shortfall. There's no more one-time money left. There's no ARA funds, no stimulus, this or that. You've got to cut stuff or raise taxes or both.
Well, and by the way, as the head of Independence Institute, let me say there is a third way. And the third way is you change the way you operate government. And it's not just cutting these services as if these services have no movement to them or raising taxes. You can competitively contract out services. You can do all sorts of innovation. You can cut para payments. You can change what's going on there and get services. The problem is we don't measure services per the dollar. And it's going to take a lot of innovation.
But is there $1 billion of efficiencies?
Yes.
Is there 100 million? Is there 200 million? Perhaps. Maybe. I don't know. But I question whether there's $1 billion. In other words, what I'm saying is whoever is governor, you're going to have to disappoint some people because you're not going to be able to do as much.
I'll go this far with you. The next governor is going to have to anger some constituents. That is, if you're going to start competitive contracting, you're going to anger the in-house unions. If you're going to be selling off assets, that's going to anger some people. And if you're going to say, instead of giving money to the unions or the in-house bureaucracy, we're going to give it to the end users, you're going to hack off higher ed.
I would note that the state broadly does competitively bid its services.
No, actually it does not. In fact, we have one of the worst constitutions in the country, in that when Ritter put on these 30,000 new jobs, they become government workers.
30,000?
I said 3,000. I'm sorry if I said something different. We have 3,000 new jobs. So when Mays says, well, I'm going to cut 2,000 jobs, you know, how do you say this? It shows you know nothing of Colorado law. You can't just cut government jobs.
Most of the jobs are ones at public universities. Okay, so 2,500 of that 4,000 jobs that get cited often, that's at universities. Many of them, if not most of them, are not funded by the general fund. So getting rid of them won't balance the budget.
Let's bring it over here. The point being that this could be a good thing for Republicans in the long run. Think so?
I think it's possible. I think, you know, part of the reason though why you see some Republican businessmen at least publicly supporting Mayor Hickenlooper is because they know, from what you said, Dan Mays may not have the slightest clue what he's doing in terms of managing something as large as a state budget. Whereas Hickenlooper has at least had some business experience. He's had some executive experience with the city of Denver. Being governor is certainly not, certainly a much more difficult job, I would say, than even being mayor of a large American city. But you know, the thing about John Hickenlooper that people will say over and over again is, above all, he's a good salesman. He's a good salesman. And when you're disappointing people, it might not be, he might be just the person to not only be running and carrying the torch for the Democrats this election cycle, and granted he's been very lucky, but also taking office. I think there are a lot of people who think that if you have to go in and make some of these very difficult choices, that he's a guy who might do a better job than others of explaining why.
Let me be a bit more skeptical. When you say there's, you know, a lot of people in the business establishment are starting to get on board with Hickenlooper, it's not because they see him as a great salesman at this point. It's that they know the winner, and you bet on the winner so you can call up the winner and say, you know, I supported you. You know, this is, you know, you see this.
That's true, but all these Republicans, and I'm not saying there's a whole, you know, line of them, but there are some notable Republicans who endorsed Hickenlooper before the governor's race went to pot, before the implosion on the Republican side of the ticket and the third party run by Tancredo. And I would agree with you, but I would just say they're not. All of this isn't just putting, you know, the smart money on Hickenlooper. I think there are people who generally believe, even Republicans, that hey, he's not a fire and brimstone liberal. He may have asked voters and you know, gotten the green light from voters to raise revenue, to raise taxes in the city of Denver, but they trust him because he has gone to the voters. He hasn't tried to run end arounds around them, and he is a guy who will stand up for the most part and face the music and say, hey, this is what we're doing. And you know, he's that cheerleader guy. You know, he's sitting there, I just get the best people in the room, I bring the Republicans and the Democrats together,
he says,
just get the best idea. He always says that.
I've never found a guy who is better at being a liberal, but his outward personality is as a business-friendly politician. You'll never say, you never hear him scream, I'm a Democrat. Even at the DNC, he was, I'm a Democrat. And here's President Obama. You know, you know, he is good at showing a business side, but really, I've never seen a more, and I say this as a compliment to him, I've never seen a politician more successful at running up taxes and debt than John Hickenlooper.
And he's getting attacked right now, and in this environment, of course, he's running for governor as a Democrat. He's going to get attacked, but you know, a guy like him, he might be not just, again, the right guy to be running for the Democrats, the right kind of candidate right now, but in such a polarized and difficult environment, electorally and in terms of governing right now, you know, he might be a good fit in the governor's mansion, at least compared to some of the options. So I think just because he's going to take that job doesn't necessarily mean, given the circumstances, that he'll be a one-term governor because he's going to make everybody upset because he's going to have to slash everything.